Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you for signing up and turning up. This is Building Trust Through Great Content. So we'll talk about EAT in Consumer Duty 2024. This was actually the first talk that we did when we launched Balance, not this particular one, but a version of this is what we did. And the study, the research actually was really popular. It was covered in the FT and in Marketing Week, and a bunch of other publications talked about it in terms of how these two areas overlap. And unsurprisingly, there's not many people talking about that because it just happens to be the Venn diagram of Balance's world. So we talked about it and no one else really was. So we'll move on, and we've got a lot of fresh research. We did the research again this year to see how things have changed, but also who are best practice out there. Right, very quickly, we're not going to do that thing where you do a timeshare talk and you get free food, but you have to listen to a sales pitch. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do it very, very quickly about Balance. So Balance launched a couple of years ago. We're a specialist digital marketing agency only for financial services. All of our clients are financial services only. Partially that's because of my background in financial services. I worked in Admiral and Go Compare, a number of other brands. And then partially because we believed that there were unique requirements financial services marketers have, which are they normally have limited resources, both in staff and money. I think we all feel that pain, particularly around budget time. We all, though, have big strategic goals. We still have that big ROI number to hit on those ratio numbers sometimes. And then, of course, ultimately, we've got regulation to deal with. And a lot of agencies are either doing crazy stuff that will put us all in jail, or they were doing very, very boring stuff. And we like to walk the line between creativity and compliance. Very quick thing, we're part of the Liberty Marketing Group, which is therefore we have access to 45 specialist marketers of very, very high standard. And then we've got some awards there, both for the group, search awards, effective marketing awards, but also Balance itself. So we won a Beamer Award for effectiveness in our first year, and just this week, which is quite nice because we get to put on the talk, Drummers called us out as one of the top 5 client-rated agencies in the UK financial services sector. So we're very proud of that. These are the various things we do. SEO, you name it in digital marketing, we do it, but we tend to specialize in SEO, content creation, paid media, social media, digital PR, and then training consultancy. These are the brands that we have worked with or are working with at the moment, are very lovely clients. So I won't dwell on that, but I'm sure you'll recognize some names there, and actually some of you might well be on the call. Okay, straight into EAT, and let's get going. Right, so EAT. For those who aren't familiar, if you are, just bear with me. Sometimes this is open to a little bit of interpretation, so I'll be curious if you disagree. By all means, put it in the chat. Daniel can't hear anything. If everyone else able to hear, if you can't hear, please let us know. This is being recorded, so if you get bored trying to hear, any issues with it, we'll do a recording. We'll send it to you afterwards, so don't panic, okay? But occasionally you have the odd person who has incompatibility with their browser and the sound doesn't come through. Mm-hmm. Great, thank you, Molly. Right, so what is EAT? So originally we had to talk about what EAT was. It used to be EEAT. It made a little bit more sense to say, but it was about expertise, authorities, and trust. Then in 2022, just around the time that Balance was forming, Google added another one, which was experience, which was quite prescient in a way, because experience is all about first-hand knowledge. So that was a big change. So EAT itself changed a number of years ago, but in a way that was very, very appropriate for the world that we live in, particularly over the last 2 years. It was meant to convey lived experience of the users, and therefore more trustworthy to listen to what was being said. We read Google's search quality rater guidelines, so you didn't have to. Apparently it's exactly the same length as the BFG, so there's a lot in there. And though not all of these things are rating criteria, I'll move on to the next slide, though not all of them are necessarily rating criteria, by conforming to them, you will tip a lot of boxes in terms of rating criteria for excellent content that's going to get you to the top of Google. I'm not going to spend a long time on this slide, but it will be available afterwards. But to break down EAT into the 4 key areas. You have experience, which we just mentioned in the most recent edition, although it's a couple of years now, which was about how much does this creator of this content have first-hand experience in the area being covered. Now, we'll talk about it a lot today, not as much as most marketing talks, but there's obviously an area where AI struggles because AI can't have first-hand lived experience of things. So that's a big differentiator there. Expertise. How great is this content? How rich is it? What detail do we have in there? How can we show that the person is not just doing a shallow 400 piece of filler content? It's a good piece of work. So that's really important. And that's why we pride ourselves on working on knowing what we're talking about. Authoritativeness. Very similar to a lot of off-page SEO type stuff. Like, how well known is this author? How well known is this brand? Who links to it? Who else? Is the website reputable? That's obviously an authority thing. We look at it in terms of things like, is there topical authority? Do they have a lot of content around this topic that implies that they might know about this stuff, as opposed to random things about, and we used to, early days of the Wild West of content, there'd be random articles about all sorts of stuff, brutalist architecture, because we wanted to get a link from a government website. You know what I mean? It was messy back in the day. This shows authority when you've got a body of content around a specific topic. And then finally, trustworthiness. How accurate, honest, safe, and reliable is the page? And that could be everything from the reviews up to, does the page load quickly? Is it functioning correctly? Do you have simple things like security certificates? So that's EAT in a whole, but we'll go into each one in a little more detail later. So why did this happen? Why did EAT exist? Well, of course, what was happening was on the front page of Google, you were starting to see more and more pieces of advice about two particularly typical areas. They call it your money or your life, right? So very typical areas that were important to not get wrong. So when you had finfluencers, as the terrible portmanteau of finfluencers, giving advice, and they had no idea what they were talking about or what to invest in and stuff like that. You can't have people who don't know about this stuff advising people. It was insane. You had, on the health side, you had Mumsnet advice coming up about what to give your child if it's got chickenpox, which, like sandpaper. I don't know. Like, it was terrible, terrible stuff. So Google realized that ranking content had to be done by reputable people in both areas. And we saw a lot of fluctuation. This is actually from 2022. Lots of fluctuations of a lot of sites being reorganized due to previously stuffer content being degraded. Now, that's all great. That's Google, right? But what's the FCA's mission? And we'll talk about consumer duty in a little bit, not too long, because it is a marketing thing at the end of the day. But I've just done 2 days in the Insurance Innovators Conference, which some of it was pretty dull, admittedly, but a lot of it was quite interesting. And what kept coming up was the word trust. And what kept coming up was people's approach to consumer duty and how critical consumer understanding of one of the 4 principles was. So same time EAT is doing this, the FCA and consumer duty is coming out at the same time going, your content needs to be clear. People need to understand what they're doing. And so we're all aligned very nicely. So the FCA and consumer duty, the FCA's actual words, when I'll read it so I don't paraphrase it incorrectly, you don't want to upset the FCA. We want to firms communications to support and enable consumers to make informed decisions about financial products and services. We want consumers to be given the information they need and presented in a way that they can understand. Put yourselves in the customer's shoes. How do your communications promote understanding and help your customers avoid foreseeable harm and pursue their financial goals? All communications are as accessible and clear as they can be. And if you operate digitally, has the firm considered how to meet communication needs? I mean, this is our ballpark. And so many of us saw consumer duty coming over the hill and might have even seen it as another hurdle to get across. But actually, we found that, if anything, it's helping us really get really great content, really refined content. We relish working with compliance teams and getting really good stuff produced. Okay, over to you, John.
Awesome. Yeah. So this slide basically, you can't talk about content generation these days without mentioning everyone's favorite acronym of AI, artificial intelligence, another one to add to your list. But essentially, it was a really interesting time back in late 2022. You had all of these new AI tools started to jump to the market and make content marketers' lives a bit easier when it comes to creating content. But then at the same time, we had search engines updating their EAT principles, while Google updated its EAT principles. Very early on, there was a lot of skepticism around, SEOs in the industry thinking that EAT was Google's sort of solution to banishing AI content from the web. But we've now learned in the years since that actually isn't the case. And you can see some quotes that I've pulled there from Google's spam policies on AI and on content generation. And I think the thing to take away is that Google doesn't really mind about where the content and how it's created, but it does care about the substance of it and the quality of it. Like I said, the not all use of automation, including AI generation, is spam. So EAT is not here, and Google is not here to penalize people for using AI, but it's here to kind of regulate it a bit and give people some parameters to work with. And the thing to take away really is quality, and that's more or less a measurement of a relevancy to a user's search. So not penalizing the use of it, just kind of giving some guardrails for people to work around.
Okay, so the Google and the Google. So my granddad, the Google. Use the Facebook and the Google. Google and the FCA agree. Your online communications need to be clear, accessible, put consumers first, and engender trust. Now, we do actually measure accessibility as part of this, which isn't a core part of EAT, but we haven't gone into it in much detail today just because there was so much to fit in. But one big thing about accessibility is actually we've seen huge leaps forward. It's actually the one category that we've seen some brilliant improvements, including a massive bank which scored horrendously last year and actually did really, really well this year. So it's good that from an accessibility perspective, and I know this means more broadly accessible, including vulnerable customers, but from a true accessibility perspective, actually there's been some great improvements over the last year, which is reassuring. Okay, so on to the study. First of all, why did we do the study? Okay, very quickly, very, very quickly. We did the study because, and it's terrible, all right, I didn't come up with this, but it's because we live, breathe, and eat, what we say. We know that first-hand research is important. We know that these things are important, and they will give us balance and our brand and our clients' brands, the authority that they need to talk about these things. So we put our money where our mouth was, and we did the research ourselves. And that's why it got a lot of coverage when we first talked about it. And people are still interested, and why we get people signing up now to these webinars is because we look at this in detail ourselves. It also makes us better because, we aren't the absolute authority on everything. And we see some fantastic stuff out there that didn't come from us. And we go, right, well, we need to do something like that, in terms of the way content is approached. So we did that. So what do? We looked at 50 of the top financial services sites. They covered a decent mix of banking, building societies, insurers, price comparison, investment firms, and consultancy firms. I always caveat the consultancy firms. They're your KPMGs, your Deloitte, etc. They might be thought of consultancies, but actually they're often considered accountancy firms as well, and audit firms. So their skills are how they present themselves is very, very relevant. What we found, as always, was quite eye-opening. So, just to explain the chart, and I love being able to use a radar diagram. I've never found any use for it apart from in these studies. So to be clear, the yellow box is 2024, the dark shade is 2023. What we have seen across the board are sometimes very moderate improvements, but sometimes quite considerable improvements. Experience. As we talked about, this is an area where most firms struggle to take advantage of their in-house talent. The reason for this is because you think, well, hold on, the in-house expert isn't going to be able to sit down and talk about, in-house experts are not going to sit down and talk about this. They're really busy. They can't be banging out an article for me, and actually, I don't want them writing an article for me. And so I think we've always stepped back from that using our head of home insurance or our lending and investments specialist or whatever. Actually, you don't need them to write the content. They can just be a key part of the authorship, and you can internally or use an external agency interview them for the content. So I think, but that might be one of the reasons that this area is held back. It's also another area, though, that can give you a great deal of differentiation against AI-generated content. Now, we're not anti-AI here. We're really not. It'd be crazy to be against using these tools. But in terms of generating content, there are going to be a lot of brands that just shove content out there generated through GPT or whatever. But what it can never do is be a real person in terms of its first-hand experience. So that's a big area where content can stand out. One of the biggest improving areas, though, was insurance. We noticed this year. Obviously, in-house experts are being used a lot more. Building societies scored 0 for this. The same as 2023, which is a strange one, right? Really, But I think it's just something they haven't quite caught up with. I actually spoke to the head of marketing of quite a big building society that was in this study and asked why this is. And it's largely just a matter of resource and time. The challenges we just talked about, they've got so many things to get through. They generally are less well-resourced than a lot of financial services sectors. And so they're just not really writing stuff in first hand. They'll quote people in their PR and stuff, and our specialist lending said this, but none of it's authored by those people. So it's definitely an area to concentrate on. Consulting and accounting firms, unsurprisingly, continue to do exceptionally well, as do price comparison, because they get that this stuff is important. And their rankings in Google said always reflect that. Big standouts this year, though, Vitality were one of the big insurers that leapt forward. Standard Life continued to be a really, really good standard. No pun intended for this. And again, Citi, unsurprisingly, very good. Okay, expertise. Despite being in the numbers industry, you still see a lot of quite shallow content out there. So what we have noticed, and again, a lot of that stuff for content, content used to fill in its truest definition, 400-word articles that aren't really giving you anything new you haven't read a million times before, or at least is not a different take on what's been written a million times before. I do wonder whether some of this dumbing down is almost an effort to conform to Consumer Duty, because we actually saw a couple of things not improve at all, and I actually stepped backwards a little bit. Maybe there's too much of a dumbing down of content to help consumer understanding. Our argument might be that it's going too far. The real skill is, of course, communicating complex things in a clear way. Insurance building sites, banks were scoring worse here. Price comparison content stepped up considerably. You've got a lot richer now, a lot more references to external resources, a lot more stuff around that. So yeah, some big moves. Prudential actually were one of the ones that improved considerably in accessibility. Compare the Market, have got some really great content, and Deloitte again, doing really well. I'm going to whip through these very quickly. Authority, because Authority didn't change. Barely changed, slightly in investment. The scores are almost exactly the same. Banks definitely saw the most improvement, but they sort of just neutralized those that didn't improve at all, or actually got a little bit worse. One of my takes on this, and I spoke to John about this as he's the content expert, not me, is that actually changing your authority is a much slower thing. It's a change to your entire strategy. It's worth doing and it's important, but it's not something you can do by just sticking some author schema on there and putting some more links in and adding more charts. You've got to almost change your entire content strategy or move your entire content strategy. So that's why certain areas just barely moved at all. Also, it's a very high scoring one. Consulting, price comparison, they already do exceptionally well. Authority, banking, etc., and building societies still got a way to go. And I don't mean this to criticize, I just mean that if you're in those sectors, it means you've got a big opportunity to focus on getting better at those areas. And then finally, trust. Again, in a very ephemeral term, but what we look at here when we went on those pages was how clear is it to find the content, how easy is it to use the site, our reviews really readily available. All of those things just give you a warm, fuzzy feeling when you go to say, oh, no, I trust these guys. I mean, it's your money at the end of the day. A call out for me was Hargreaves Lansdown. So when we did it, we compared to the previous year and we used Wayback Machine to look at the previous year, why the scores have shifted so much, because I can't necessarily remember what the website looked like a year ago. And Hargreaves Lansdown, if any of them are on the call today, have done a massive change. So it's a really good site to look at. It's quite a complex site now, but in terms of, it's not been dumbed down to, it's just been made so much easier to use. So if you want an example of a great site improvement, I really love that. Okay, we're now moving on to John.
Excellent. Yeah. So what we've been really keen to do is kind of distill a lot of the search quality rated guidelines and things into a bit of an auditable process. And I've done all manner of these now in the past couple of years since we launched Balance, and we've definitely got it down to a bit of a fine process now. So I'm just running through some guidelines really, and the things that we've learned that you can part ways with today that can really start to improve your conformity to all of these things.
One thing before we start your section, should we do the poll?
Yes, let's do the poll.
Oh, look, we had someone join our meeting room then. Don't tell everyone you're doing the webinar. We still get people join. We'll have a word with them later. Right. Okay. We've got a quick poll here, and we flew through that. And a lot of you will be familiar with EAT already potentially. But we've got a quick poll of which part of EAT do you have the most problems with, or do you find the most confusing? It's an anonymous vote. It's not like it's okay if you can say whatever you like. But hopefully the poll should have appeared on your screen. Did it appear on your screen?
It's appeared on my screen, yeah.
So we'll give everyone about 30 seconds to click an area. The only reason we do that is because we're about to go into it. And if there's another area, you go, nah, this all makes perfect sense to me. I'm going to put my answer in. I find, what do I find? I find authority the most confusing. And actually, but there we go. Look at that, authority. So maybe I subconsciously. So that's a really interesting one.
I'll submit an answer as well. Okay, there we go. So we've got a few votes coming through now.
Yeah, we'll keep our. Oh, we got some more.
Definitely seems like authority is.
Definitely seems like authority. That's interesting. Okay, well, we'll cover that. Well, we'll cover them all, but and actually the others are pretty equal. But we'll cover that in a little bit more detail if you don't mind when we get to that page.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're okay for time of 7 minutes, and we're happy to run over, but I know not all will be well, so we'll do our best to keep to exactly time. Okay, so the results of the poll were 16 of you were most loose in authority, probably due to my terrible explanation prior. So you can do that. Trust coming under that, experience, and then expertise. I think expertise is almost the bit everyone gets the most because it's just make your content rich and full of detail and it's more practical.
Yeah,
okay,
absolutely.
Lovely. Over to you, sir.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So just clicking away this poll results box here and moving on to the next slide. So yes, first of all then, experience. I say first of all, experience was actually the last thing to be added to EAT. So a bit of a backwards way of doing it, I suppose, in terms of being time-wise. But yes, just a very quick recap. Experience was added in December 2022. It's the latest E to be added to EAT. And it's not to be confused with the user or browser experience. Experience is just around how you can convey your lived experience with the subject at hand or the author's lived experience with the subject at hand. Now, this is conveyed in quite a few ways, and including the use of things like authorship, as Alex mentioned, where you attribute pieces of content directly to people with actual relevant experience on the subject. And then within the content itself, it's really important to refer back to that experience and help you make statements, not verbatim of this, of course, but you're trying to convey this sentiment of, I've done this because I've been there, I've done that, and promptly gotten the t-shirt, I suppose. Experience also extends to your ability to kind of give recommendations and more detailed advice and information based on that prior experience and evidencing that throughout the content. And I think, the thing is that for people that are using, or for brands that are using AI more prominently, this is something that their websites are going to naturally fall down on quite heavily because, after all, on a basic principle, AI learns from things that humans teach it. So it fundamentally can't provide the same level of experience-backed information in the same way that a person can. So it's just showing your readers, like the slide says, you've been there, you've done that. And you've, as I say, promptly gotten the t-shirt for it. And then we have a nice example here for conveying experience, and this is from KPMG. But we've selected this purely because you look at the subject of it, and it's the global economic outlook. And then you refer to the author bio for the person that's authored this piece, and it quite literally mentions things like experience with advising on global economic outlooks. That's not the end-all, be-all of conveying that experience, but it's just a really good example because it's kind of demonstrating it in the content and in that person's sort of author bio itself. A very, very strong signal that this person absolutely has the stock to talk about that subject. If I skip through to the next slide.
There
we go. And then, the next one then is expertise. And to be an expert, you need to convey your sheer knowledge and experience of a sector in a really helpful and meaningful manner. We do this by going the extra mile within your content, by making it super detailed and precise to the point where, you're sort of innovating where other people have neglected to do so. Give evidence of that expertise by not only linking to your first-party research, perhaps, but also linking outwards to the research of others. Now, in the world of SEO, we continually preach about things like internal linking to map out your website and make sure that people can see it properly and that search engines can crawl it properly. But when it comes to expertise, there's a real demand to not only link to that material, but to also link to your any research that you've also used to back up your points. This isn't to say that your own data should be kind of deprioritized, and I think if anything, it should receive a slightly higher priority in your content. And I've seen this in multiple times with some of my clients where, if we're targeting some really competitive keywords, provided that we can bring something unique to the table, a lot of the times that really does give that piece a really significant boost in sort of appearing it in higher compared to other articles that maybe haven't been updated in a while. And I've got an example for expertise here from Standard Life. And I just think this is a really great example of it. The article in question that you can see here links to some of Standard Life's internal resources, like its Earth Day Hub. But then it also has this really nice, lengthy bibliography of sorts right at the end of the article that says, here's where I've gotten all the information from. Here's where I've used it to back up my points. So a very nice mixed use of first-party and third-party research. So it's a really good example. Okay, so authority, the one that everyone found a little bit tricky to understand. So it's, as I say, it is quite hard to understand. So I'll do my best to kind of explain it. But when we look at authority, we kind of look at it in two ways. We look at it through both on-site indications of authority and off-site engagement measurements of authority. For on-site, authority is established through things like using the correct schema markup language on your content to highlight who has written it, the type of page that a search engine is looking at, and the substance of the material, what it's about. It's about ensuring that your pieces are authored by people that are internal experts within your business, but also featuring external experts on the subject as well. So you could use things like guest blogging, where you feature a lot of people that have a lot of knowledge and authority on those particular subjects, but featuring them on your own website. That's a nice way of doing it as well. So it's not just about housing all of the expertise internally, it's about going out there and seeking other people's expertise and referencing that as well. And Alex mentioned this, there's also the concept of topical authority, which is, I'll try to summarize it quite briefly, but it's a measurement really, or a way of gauging your website's or your author's rights or ability really to comment on something. So if you're an insurance business, for example, and you have a specialization in kind of business insurance policies, then perhaps that is the subject that you really want to delve into and have the most authority on. So to do that, you'd spend quite a lot of time and resources fleshing out your content strategy and really making it a core part of that, and making sure that you are discussing the subject as much as you can. Just trying to make your site the kind of go-to spot for that subject, if that makes sense. And then when it comes to offsite, we improve authority by looking at mainly how many times websites are linked to around the web through things like backlinks. But it's not just the number of those backlinks that we look at. We actually look at the quality of them as well. Because it's quite easy to accumulate a lot of low quality backlinks. And what I mean by low quality is from websites that are quite old, have low domain authority for themselves, which is another sort of proprietary SEO metric, which is a score out of 100 that gauges how strong a website is in passing on its own authority. So if you can gain a lot of links back from PR stories or campaigns from really high quality domains, you're really going to improve your brand's authority as well as the sort of technical performance of your site. So
we're spending a bit more time on that. Okay,
definitely. Awesome. And then I've got an example then of authority from Admiral. This is a really nice example. You can see that the article in question here, which is about MOTs and electric cars, the author just happens to continually write about the fact that they are a car journalist. If you wanted to go extremely granular on it, the pictures of themselves that they have on their social profiles of them stood next to cars, sat in cars, you can tell that this person really has quite a lot of a bit of a stake of claim within this subject. But then even if we look back on the site, then it's continually linking back to related content. Just sort of, you can see really that Admiral's made a very conscious effort to sort of establish some topical authority within this subject.
Okay, we've hit our half-hour mark. We're happy to continue, but obviously, if anyone does need to jump off, we can send you the slides afterwards. But we're good. We've got another 5 minutes or so.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So then, trust is what comes last, but it's central to everything that goes on throughout this whole process. Trust is, as Alex mentioned briefly as well, where we saw a lot of crossover between the FCA's consumer duty, and it's clearly something that Google has also really considered in its EAT principles and demands from websites really in nowadays. It's not more of a nice to have, it's definitely something that it needs to see. And we can boost trust by doing some really practical things like displaying and referring to successful stories that we've had and impacts on customers' lives, case studies, testimonials, and things like that. having pictures of actual people on your landing pages, which might sound like a really small thing, but seriously, in the age of AI that we're in now and image generation and video generation, having genuine people featuring on your site is not so much a nice to have, it's also a pretty big demand.
To be clear on that one, that's not necessarily have stock photos of humans. It's more like if there's people, your staff, the actual real people who work for you, in your about us pages and things like that. You can go photography or not. Not about aesthetics, just to be clear.
Yeah, exactly. It's putting a face to the name to convey it simply, but it's also about giving your users a really satisfying user journey across the site, making it very easy to find the path of going to conversion, showing your content is kept up to date and continually maintained. And speaking of content, it should be written in a way that allows your users to kind of gain as much necessary information that they need without kind of being pushed and pulled in either direction, because that can come across as a bit disingenuous, especially when it comes to trust. And then there are also some quite technical things that we do with trust, like Alex mentioned briefly as well, like, does your website have a security certificate assigned to it? Is it actually visible? Have you submitted things like sitemaps to Google and to other search engines? It's also things like, do you have a privacy policy visible, or what's your stance on GDPR? All of these things, search engines and people need to know to engender trust in your brand. So it's really quite pivotal. And then I've got another great example of this here from Skipton Building Society. I think this is more of an on-site example, but it's still worth highlighting just because it's so deliberate. But they've really chosen to continually reference how satisfied their customers are and showcase their rewards where possible. And these really are the kind of building blocks of trust. And sort of without these, you're going to have a lot of users questioning how dependable your brand really is.
Things like Trustpilot are really interesting because some people might call it a bit of a protection racket, right? Because Trustpilot's very, very expensive. But if you don't have a Trustpilot thing on your site, people might be a bit... Any kind of reviews are positive. It doesn't have to be Trustpilot. We just tend to see that a lot. But it is really critical. People use those star ratings thanks to the world of Amazon. They do use those as factors in deciding it. And I think any time I go to a brand that does have reviews but doesn't stick them on their homepage now, it blows my mind. So definitely use them wherever you can. It's the ultimate. It's better than anything as marketers we can say, is what other customers say. Social proof.
Okay. Awesome. And yeah, that's every piece of the puzzle really when it comes to EEAT. And what this kind of shows is that everything sort of staggers together just to show you how it all falls into place. So, for example, for experience, you need an experienced author that has the right level of knowledge to produce some really good content. That content ultimately houses that experience and expertise. And the way that you ensure it's seen is by establishing an authoritative position for your brand for the content that you write. So you establish your content authority, your topical authority, and that's ultimately dictated by your marketing strategy. And of course, that expertise needs to be contained somewhere trustworthy, so your website and your brand, to ensure it's visible and accessible to those interested. So you can see they all kind of play together in this nice way, and they all kind of stagger downwards.
Okay. This is you. So AI, particularly, can't avoid it.
No, definitely can't avoid it. I think, yeah, just one more slide from me. I very briefly touched on AI at the beginning, but I really wanted to highlight this just to ensure that those who come along today really part ways with some really practical advice on how AI can be used, especially when it comes to financial services. So, first of all, I don't need to tell everyone how regulated the financial sector is, but it definitely is worth noting that there are some very serious regulations and restrictions in place to kind of vet the marketing activity of everything that we do. Those regulations can be very tricky to maneuver, as I'm sure you'll know. And you'll undoubtedly probably have entire teams dedicated to ensuring that you don't fall foul of them. But the thing is, that something that we've learned is that AI isn't really great at this stuff. It's not the best at navigating those regulations. It's prone to making mistakes. It's prone to hallucination, I think the correct term is, where it sort of goes off on its own little tangent and sometimes repeats itself. Less so nowadays with newer LLMs that are out there. GPT 3.5 is infinitely better to 4, and 4.0 is even greater again, but it's still prone to errors. And I think the inspiration behind this slide really was that there was a very interesting article that came out recently highlighting the fact that Google's AI tools actually fail 43% of all financially related questions that are asked of it. And you can see some examples that it got correct and incorrect on the right. And they range from things like advising on student loan repayment plans to some state-by-state financial rulings over in the US. So given that a lot of these chatbots and a lot of these LLMs are trained on very similar data sets, not identical, very similar, there is some potential for these statistics to be applicable to other LLMs as well. So I think the thing to take away is I don't want to scare anyone away from using AI, because it is a really invaluable tool of getting you a nice first start and a way of sort of establishing that content pipeline for yourselves. But I think the thing is, like the slide says, just tread lightly. Don't use it solely without checking it over. Make sure it's reviewed at least a couple of times or a few times for accuracy, and your tone of voice as well, because that's really crucial here, which also feeds into EAT. I think at the end of the day, your brand is at stake with this kind of stuff. So no one wants to be one that gets caught, saying something wildly incorrect, or at the very least leaving, the tail end of your prompt at the bottom of an article. That kind of stuff can cause some very severe damage. And yes, so just tread lightly. Don't be scared of it, but just tread lightly.
Okay, and just one more thing about LLMs, because what we've noticed, so we were lucky enough that we partner with SimilarWeb. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but they are probably the leading competitor intelligence tool. And we work with them on a few areas, because we work with financial services, both of us. And they've started doing, and their access to data is incredible. And they've started doing quite a considerable amount of research into what's happening in terms of recommendations of financial services brands, and what's happening to the traffic as a result of the massive adoption of LLMs and GPT, etc. And what they notice, and we have got a full webinar talking about this in much more detail, just this one topic. And the QR code is there if you can scan it now, or we'll send a link later in the follow-up email to this webinar with the slides. But what we're noticing is significant shifts in the visibility of certain brands. So when you ask ChatGPT or any of these tools, where should I get my car insurance, or what's the best car insurance for my classic car, or what should I do with this, what about my learner driver insurance, anything like this, it doesn't necessarily produce the results that you'd expect. It doesn't naturally, you'd think it'd just go to Google, look at the top 5 results and then spit those out. It doesn't do it that way. You take an example here. So this is a homepage of Google. I've had to obfuscate it because this was, we need more clinical conditions for that left-hand results. I wanted to make sure it's cross-referenced, but also because we'll go into much more detail in a few weeks' time. But the top result was only recommended by an AI 5% of the time. The second result, and tends to be a certain category of at a website, was never suggested in most LLMs. Then you've got some of the core brands, the popular brands that we're all familiar with. They actually came up. Often they'd be in the top 5 recommendations, the 50% of the time, 50% of the time. Again, not 100% though. And bear in mind, these brands have 100% visibility on Google currently, or near as damn it, right? And then you have like some of the others just 0% again. Right now, this isn't the sky is falling chicken little stuff, right? But, and to a degree, Google's almost countering it by pulling and bringing its own little snippets and trying to, but you also are seeing some major brands just not get referenced at all in AI, which I think we need to be very aware of. And we'll be talking in a few weeks about what can be done for that. Because of course, we can also work with AI to find out why it's using those brands, why it's recommending them. And there's a whole thing to look at in that. So I will cover that. But a lot of it's much more about, not so much about the specific content, but more about the broader brand experience and the broader brand awareness. So, but there's a plus side to this as well. So if you're a big brand, you might be quite nervous. But if you're a smaller brand, we've noticed with some clients now, certain articles which haven't really ranked, their older articles didn't rank that great. They're suddenly getting big troves of traffic, and that's because of Google's AI recommendations pulling them up from like page 2 or 3. Smaller articles, edge articles, that are suddenly being pulled out a lot and getting a lot of visibility. So there's a lot of opportunity to be had here, as well as things to be aware of. So in summary, I'm sorry we run over by about 10, 12 minutes, but it was inevitable. Google and FCA want the same things in terms of at least the online experience. They want clarity. They want stuff to be trustworthy. They want consumers to have understood what they've read and been able to make an informed decision afterwards. But as we've noticed time and again, there are some improvements. there's still huge opportunities for brands that can really lean into this stuff and really understand it and work with their compliance teams who also will be supporting of this stuff. So yeah, it's so exciting to work with a brand. Whenever we get a new financial service brand, you saw the logos. It's the first stuff we do is we audit the content for EEAT, and it's one of the things that we can, and we're happy to do that. If you get in touch with us, we'll help you with that. We'll do that as part of just being someone to join the call. We'll have a little bit of an EEAT audit with you if you want to talk it through. But you were able to a degree with the stuff that you've got here to do a bit of it yourself and go, are we doing this stuff? It doesn't mean you have to slap an author on everything. It doesn't mean like everything has to have 20 charts in it and a bibliography, but there's a big, vast gap between doing it on everything and what's out there at the moment. So yeah, and of course, if you do need to speak to us, please get in touch. Now we've run over, so we do have time for questions, but I don't think we had anything in the chat, although I've noticed about 3 emails since we were doing this. So here we go. Jenny Burton and John, it's going to be a technical question, so I'm immediately going to ask you to take it.
Absolutely. Let me just pull it up. So how do you reference in-house data in a source list / bibliography? Is it enough to say source in-house data, or should you have a separate paper detailing the research that was done? It's a very interesting question. I think when it comes to first-party data, I think displaying it in a publicly viewable way is obviously the most trustworthy way of conveying that data, because the numbers that you're referencing within that data could be obfuscated for whatever reason. If we're looking at it purely from an outsider's perspective and not leveling any sort of accusations or anything like that, but I think displaying it publicly would be the way to go. And you could do that on a landing page where you sort of decant some of the research and highlight it, perhaps in a separate post, perhaps. I'm a big fan of making sure that is nice, publicly viewable to readers.
We when we did the EEAT research ourselves, we broke down our methodology. So because if you pivot to the press need to trust that what you're telling them is not just made up. So we broke down a methodology of how we did it to make sure that people knew that the research was valid. So that's always I think that's worth doing. How can I trust this? Well, these are the steps they took to remove bias or to make sure it was a fair mix, etc. So we did a lot of that. There's a question from Molly there.
So how does Google pick up on the credentials that make someone authoritative? Are there particular keywords? So there was a bit of an algorithm leak earlier this year. And we as SEOs, we had kind of always knew that Google would kind of look at the author of a piece and store it and then reference it across the web. But there was a very short glimpse into how that's done. And essentially, Google looks at a page and picks up the name of the author via text, and it then stores that information, which kind of tells us that it then kind of does a bit more of a deeper research to find out where that author is elsewhere mentioned. And then obviously Google is very good at understanding words with things like semantic indexing as well. So we know that it's very good at mapping different words and sort of mapping them together. But I think that would be probably my answer to that, is that Google is able to pick up on it in its crawl, store that information, and then cross-reference it with other articles and social profiles that are out there on the web. Because, of course, Google does display those in search results as well for different authors. So, yeah, that would be my answer for that.
The fancy term for it back when it was all starting was the social graph, wasn't it? It's like it's got a network map of all these individuals to a degree. And what we didn't know when EEAT first came in is how much it was actually using it and how much of it was just guidelines.
Yeah.
Whereas, of course, the leak, as all the SEO nerds got super excited as they poured through it page by page and line by line, told us actually it's using it a lot more literally than we thought. So it is very important.
Yeah.
Okay, I did see someone type a question, but I think maybe we answered it. So, right, we will share. Well, the video will get uploaded afterwards. Thank you so much for everyone, and thank you for staying on.
Thank you.
I still got like a couple of dozen of you still on here, so I really appreciate that. Yeah. We'll share the slides afterwards. The event is coming in a month's time, and SimilarWeb will be co-hosting that with us. So yeah, thank you very much. Have a lovely rest of the week.